Laurie, thanks for that introduction, and thank you all, ladies and gentlemen, for turning out this afternoon for my inaugural address. And I thought I would present on this project that I've been working on for the past 2 years. And this is the moment when I say thank you to my funders, the Economic and Social Research Council and the Arts Research Council, for funding a 3-year fellowship to enable me to do this research, among other things. And really, actually, I've been working on this for 2 years, and what I want to do today is present 2 cuts at the story of the campaign, the British campaign in Helmand. And the first cut I'll talk about today was very much guided by work I've done in the past on organization theory, on how militaries innovate and adapt. And after a year or so of research, I produced what I thought was a pretty good story on how the campaign had unfolded. And then I went and did some more research, and I discovered a slightly different story. So I'm going to give you 2 cuts at the story. But a good place to start is here, with the key terrain. This is the key terrain that the British are fighting for. That is the people of Helmand. And of course, here one's reminded of the French coin theorist David Gallua, who said, in this new counter-revolutionary war, what we call counterinsurgency, the people are the key ground. Now, of course, a very quick guide of how we got from 9/11 to here. Essentially, ISAF was established in December of 2001 to provide security in Kabul after the Taliban had been pushed out by the Americans and the British. And then in August of 2003, NATO takes over ISAF. And ISAF, the International Security Assistance Force, takes responsibility by degrees for security in Afghanistan, starting in the north and then moving to the west and to the south and to the east over a 3-year period. And over this period, ISAF grows from a force of about 5,000 to around about 50,000. So a very ambitious expansion by NATO, the first global security mission, really beyond Europe. And the British take responsibility for Helmand. Now, this is really a story of a series of brigade campaigns, because what the British do is they deploy a series of brigades, each serving a 6-month tour. And this is how I'm looking at the campaign. And what you find, you can see immediately, is it starts off small and gets bigger as it goes along. A big point to make here is this was a big stretch for a small army. The British Army was 101,000 strong. And of course, you can add the Royal Marines. 8,500 were already committed in 2006 in Iraq. So it was by no means easy. It was a very impressive feat to pull together a second operation in Afghanistan. But in part, this explains why 3,000, just over 3,000 were sent. I mean, this has been the subject of much criticism of late. Why were so few sent when, as things turned out, there was very stiff resistance from the Taliban? Well, in fact, the answer is because the British were immensely overstretched, and at the time, 3,000 was a reasonable number to send. Helmand, in 2005, had a PRT which is a provincial reconstruction team doing development work, being supported by 250 American soldiers. The advanced planning team that went to Helmand in 2005 were able to drive up and down in Land Rovers. There wasn't much presence or evidence of a Taliban resistance. And so the British took a reasonable calculation. They said, we need more troops because intelligence is telling us the Taliban is reconstituting in the south. So we go from 250 American soldiers to just over 3,000 British. In the event, it wasn't enough. And very quickly, there had to be reinforcements sent. But what you also see, by the way, is that the first brigades that are sent, 16 Air Assault Brigade and 3 Commander Brigade Royal Marines, are the high readiness brigades of the British military. And that's because all the medium and heavy brigades were committed to Iraq. And in fact, the situation required a Type B brigade, 52 Brigade, an infantry brigade. Type B brigades aren't deployed overseas. That's not their job. But that was warned off and turned into a Type A brigade for deployment because the British were trying to plug a gap. So that's the context. Here's the other context. Helmand. It's a jolly tough nut for the British to crack. It's huge. It's the largest province in Afghanistan. At 62,000 square kilometres, it's almost the size of the Republic of Ireland. It's got what you expect in Afghanistan. Very tough terrain, very tough working environment, pretty lousy infrastructure, and it also has some special features. The chief one being the scale, the extent and reach of the narco economy. Half of the wealth generated in Helmand is in the narco economy. And also, it has, as you expect, therefore, very high levels of corruption in public life. It has a largely Pashtun, 95% Pashtun population, which is nevertheless tribally fragmented, xenophobic, socially conservative, and largely inclined to resist foreign interveners. So this is not an optimum environment for the British to go into for a counterinsurgency operation. It was a tough job that they took on. Here then is my first cut. My first cut is basically from mid-2006 up to late 2007, a series of British brigades attempt to leverage combat power to defeat the Taliban, or at least dislodge them from the main population centres. And then in late 2007, the British approach changes to one more focused on securing the population and developing government. And therefore, less focused on combat capability, and more focused on developing new capabilities in what are called non-kinetic, that's non-firepower orientated stuff, influence operations. When 16 Air Assault Brigade originally deployed, the plan was quite simple. The plan was to concentrate an area from Lashkargah to Gereshk. Lashkargah here is the political capital of Helmand. Gereshk is the main economic centre of Helmand. This is Highway 1 running along. So you focus in this area here, and you gradually spread security by ink spots. That was the job when 16 Air Assault Brigade deployed. Instead of going here, they went up here. So that's a bit different, right? They deployed into the northern towns of Nawzad, Musakala, and Sangin. And essentially what happened was when they arrived, the governor there, Governor Mohammed Dawud, he was under a lot of pressure himself from his district governors in the north. They said, we're coming under pressure from the Taliban. We desperately need military support to protect us because we're risking losing these towns. He passed pressure down the line to the task force commanders, and he said, you have to get up there. You have to urgently get up there to protect these towns. And so, in a sense, I think it would be reasonable to say that the brigadier concerned felt that he had to support the provincial governor. Because bear in mind, we, the British, had requested that the previous guy, Sher Mohammed Akhzida, who was quite corrupt, be replaced by Mohammed Dawud. So we can't ask for a new governor and then not support the governor. So the 16 Air Assault Brigade, quite soon after deploying, goes off the task and ends up getting fixed in these garrison towns, which are then surrounded by Taliban, and you have these gun battles you can view on YouTube. Next brigade coming along, Royal Marine Commandos, 3 Brigade, they see what's happening, and they say, well, we can't have that. So their plan is to unfix the north, and instead create these mobile operational groups, these MOGs, as they're called. So 40 vehicles, 250 strong. And they tear around after the Taliban. And instead of focusing on this area here called the Green Zone up and down the Helmandi River, they end up tearing around into the desert, chasing Taliban. And invariably, in fact, the Taliban know they're coming. They set ambushes, lots of fighting in the desert. But 3 Brigade are still involved in combat against the Taliban, but of a different sort, much more mobile. 12 Brigade come along, and 12 Brigade, again, trying to learn from the previous deployment. And what they realized was that 3 Brigade Commander had been mostly operating in the desert, and yet the key population area is up and down the Helmandi River, the Green Zone. So 12 Brigade focuses on trying to clear this key terrain in Upper Gereshk Valley between Gereshk and Sangin through a series of task force level operations going up and down trying to clear the Green Zone. Net effect is tons of fighting. So an original British plan, which was to support development in governments, becomes a war. It's a focus on fighting for this first 18 months. Post-operation reports indicate this. 16 Brigade says, yeah, we didn't manage to do an awful lot of development or supporting governance, but by God, we managed to kill a lot of Taliban. 3 Command Brigades say, well, what we are trying to do is keep the Taliban at bay. And some justification to that. there was a 45% reduction in Taliban attacks on British bases and district centres, the population centres, under 3 Commander Brigade. And likewise, 12 Mechanised Brigade, when they were preparing for deployment, there was a lot of talk then, as still there always is, about the Taliban offensive in the summer. There was going to be a big Taliban offensive in the summer. So the brigadier in charge of 12 Mechanised Brigade, his thinking was, well, if there's going to be an offensive, it'll be ours. In other words, we'll take the initiative from the Taliban. It'll be an ISAF offensive. And of course, therefore, what you see, troops in contact is basically firefights, is a huge increase in firefights over this period. 52 Brigade, again, learning the lessons from the previous brigades come along, and they decide to adopt a whole new approach. And again, if you read the operational design, which is basically the plan for 2 Brigade, there are references to David Galua, all the Coin classics. The brigadier in charge of that, Andrew Mackay, had been reading drafts of FM 324, the new US Army, US Marine Corps doctrine, which is the Petraeus doctrine, basically. And it was emphasizing what is effectively classic Coin theory. The prize is the population. That is the key ground. Our job is to win their consent. That must be our main effort. And therefore, for instance, when Mackay was deploying his units into their bases in Helmand, he was saying, right, get comfortable, because you're there for 6 months. I'm not going to rotate you around Helmand. You go into your base, you stay there for 6 months, because your key job is actually to build relationships with locals. That's your key job. So I'm not going to move you around, because that's going to mess with that. And he also tried to rebalance kinetic and non-kinetic. The military are very good at kinetic, which is basically fighting and firing things and blowing things up. What they've had to learn to do is become a lot better at non-kinetic. That's effectively influence operations, supporting development, having cups of tea with locals. So this is this new approach that 52 Brigade bring in. And in this first cut at it, I see how this new approach continues into successive brigades. So the brigade that follows, which is 16 Brigade again, under Mark Carlton Smith, put a big emphasis on development in their approach. And in fact, their big signal operation is to take some turbines up to Kajaki, because that was critical as far as ISAF was concerned, to try and get power up and running in the south. How do I explain the change that occurs over this period? It is a story of adaptation. Every single brigade goes into the environment, extremely challenging environment, and adapts, learns lessons and adapts. And here I was drawing very heavily on organization theory, and it emphasizes in particular, you know, how organizations change is because new people arrive with new ideas. That's really quite pronounced in the literature. And of course, you see the British have in their approach to operations is called mission command, which is the commander on the ground is given enormous latitude to shape his own plan, to shape his own campaign. And you do see that. I mean, clearly the brigade commanders had instruction from superior command, from ISAF command, and from back home here, Permanent Joint Headquarters. But actually, they were able to shape their own campaign. This has been criticized. It's been argued that the British have not had a continuity of approach, but instead you've had a series of 6-month campaigns. And there is something to that. It is true that there's been quite a lot of discontinuity across the campaigns. But the upside is, it gives each 6 months a fresh chance to try and get it right, to try something new. And so we do see, therefore, new people bring in new ideas. You also see a number of other things that are going on. Taliban tactics change. In early 2008, they switch. Up to then, the Taliban had been launching frontal assaults on British bases, absolutely suicidal stuff. And in 2008, they shift. And they shift instead to what everyone calls asymmetric. That is, instead of using direct assaults by small units, they use IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And you begin to see an exponent increase in the use of IEDs. Under 16 air assault in 2008, they report each month a doubling in IED attacks or detections on their units. The brigade that follows, 3 Commander Brigade, report over their tour a 40% increase in IEDs. IEDs become the biggest killer of British troops. Now, that's not to underestimate the threat. It's a huge threat. But my overall point is that's good. It's good that the Taliban shift to IEDs. Because if you're trying to secure and stabilize population centers and you've got a choice between IEDs, which are very challenging and difficult for our troops, or pitched battles, choose IEDs any day of the week. Because you can't stabilize, you can't create a sense of normalcy and security if you've got pitched battles in or around district centers. And the other thing is increased resources. Firstly, numbers. Troop numbers go up. That's critically important. And as I'll argue later, that's very important for the mission. But you also see new resources in terms of the equipment. The mobile operation groups, the MOGs, that 3 Commander Brigade were operating in 2007, were Land Rovers. How much armour do you see in that? How protected do you think they feel? Lots of heavy weapons, not much armour. At the end of 12 Brigade's tour, and at the beginning of 52 Brigade, this comes on stream. Mastiff. This is basically what the Americans call MRAP. It's our version. In fact, very kindly, the Americans diverted an MRAP production line to feed the British Mastiffs. Very, very effective in terms of counter-IED. Interesting enough, however, the one thing that doesn't really come on stream, I mean, overall, there's a thing called the UOR, the Urgent Operational Requirement. It actually works. It's a success story. Lots of equipment comes online very fast. This thing appears within a year. I mean, I previously studied weapons acquisition, and it takes decades to acquire new weapons. They're invariably over cost, over budget, over time. But the UORs, these things appear really fast. These things come on stream quite slowly. In the beginning of the operation, there's only a couple of these flying around in Helmand. By 2007 and 8, we're up to about 8, but only about 4 or 5 are on stream at any one time. This is a desperate shortage of helicopters, and anyone who's been to Helmand knows this is still a problem. Less so now, but thanks to the Americans. Desperate shortage of helicopters. And actually, I remember I was doing an interview for the BBC in the summer of 2009, and I was going in because the story had broke about helicopters and the government was in trouble. And I was in the BBC studio waiting to go in for interview, and there was the Prime Minister Gordon Brown appearing before the House of Commons Defence Committee, and they had hauled him up to berate him about the lack of helicopters. They'd just done a big report. And what was actually happening was the British were just getting anything that could fly with rotary wing into theatre. So Sea Kings were being pressed into service. And it's funny, actually, only when you get into theatre do you realise, you really get a sense of things that you can't see from reading books or reports. This looks like a perfectly pleasant helicopter ride. This is the route from Lashkar to Nadali. It's about 25-30 minutes. Perfectly pleasant, lovely sunny day, flying low over some compounds, nothing to be alarmed there. That's pretty standard for British helicopters in theatre. Absolutely lovely. The thing about a Sea King is it's not very good at hot or high. I remember I first heard that expression, hot and high. What's that mean? I didn't quite know, actually. What it means is they're not very good at flying in hot climates, and helicopters that aren't good at flying in hot climates can't fly very high either, because it affects their ability to carry lift and to fly high. And actually what I realized when I was on this particular trip, that's not my photograph, but on this trip in June in Helmand, is it's bloody hot in Helmand in the summer. It's unbelievably hot. This guy's sweating a lot. So you're already incredibly hot, and then you step in a Sea King. It is literally like stepping in an oven. It's unimaginably hot. All helicopters are hot, except for the new Merlin. But the Sea King is unbelievably hot. It's like an oven. And the minute I stepped into this, I went, now I understand why these are not great helicopters for Helmand. So, really getting into theatre gets you appreciating this. Every single post-operation report by every single brigadier complains about helicopters. And indeed, Richard Dannett, former Chief of General Staff, made the point, I thought, very effectively in the summer of 2009. He toured Helmand, he complained about the lack of resources and helicopters in particular, and he allowed the Americans to fly him around, as if to make the point. I need American support. That's my first cut. It's a very satisfying story. As somebody who's also done IR theory in my previous life, and I'll probably do more of it, and I do organization theory, I like a nice, simple story. My story is based around a brigade that changes things, a commander, Andrew Mackay. And indeed, organization theory does like its heroes. James March, who is the big guru of organization theory, says if you look at the business literature, invariably it's a story of a new leader that comes and changes how things are done. Problem is, the more I look into this, the more I found a more subtle, more nuanced, more complex story. Indeed, it was very much inspired by Larry Freedman, who time and again tells various folk, just tell the story. And indeed, I presented the first cut to the Changing Character War Program in Oxford, and sure enough, perhaps predictably, the historian Hugh Strawn said to me, "That's all very interesting, this organization theory, but why don't you just tell the story?" So I put aside my theory and I went and did some more research. And what I find is a much more subtle, much more complex story. What I find actually is that the protect the population mission and the focus on development preceded 52. Previous brigades were doing that stuff. And equally, the focus on major combat operations occurred after 52. What you invariably find is something that is more difficult to communicate, but much more true to what was going on the ground. For instance, if you look at the first brigadier in charge of the first 3 Commander Brigade tour in 2007, Brigadier Jerry Thomas, he emphasized that his main effort is going to be securing a reconstruction in the Afghan development zone, which is the green zone. This image, satellite image, explains why it's called the green zone, by the way. Basically, Helmand's a desert, except for up along the Helmandi River, which is green. Guess where most of the population live? And this area here, which was irrigated in the 50s by the Americans in Helmand River Valley Project, that's where the population is. So that's where you ought to be focusing your efforts. And that's also called the Afghan Development Zone. 3 Commander Brigade said that's going to be my main effort in 2007. And they also said we're going to tread softly and minimize collateral damage in order to avoid breeding new enemies. So in the operation design, Brigadier Jerry Thomas says, almost all tactical engagements, win or lose, favor the enemy. By definition, they demonstrate instability and insecurity, thus undermining perceptions of government of Afghanistan, influence, control, and credibility. That's classic coin stuff. And likewise, the brigade that followed, 12 Brigade, Brigadier John Larmer, why are they focusing on these big clearance operations between Goresh and Sangin? Well, because he was looking at what 3 Brigade had done, and notwithstanding the fact that Jerry Thomas said, this is going to be my main effort, his approach was to put out his mobile groups out here to keep the enemy at bay, to keep them away from the Afghan development zone. Brigadier John Larmer comes along and says, well, actually, that's all well and fine, but they're not having an enduring effect. So therefore, I'm going to focus my efforts and my resources in this green zone. And his key concept was persistent presence, very similar to what Andrew Mackay was saying. The problem with these earlier tours was they were facing a desperate shortage of resources. There's just no ways, there's no doubts about that. Shortage in terms of British forces and equipment, but also critically, Afghan partners, Afghan security forces, which really weren't up to scratch at the time and in low number, and also, crucially, Afghan government. At the time, the governor was Governor of Wafa, who was described as a perfectly nice old man, but really not what you want, which is the current governor, who was appointed in March 2008, Gulab Mangal, who's this highly dynamic person. If we're talking about Afghan-led, I mean, basically, in coin, you're as good as the government you support, and that's true at a provincial level as it is at a national level. That's very significant. In the new story, in the new cut, the second cut, other things emerge, such as what happened on the 11th of October 2008. So again, 3 Commander Brigade come back for a second tour under a new Brigadier Gordon Messenger. And they have a plan that builds on the previous tours. About a week into their tour, they take their plan, bring it over to the shredder, and they shred it. What happens? What happens is, a few days after they take responsibility, a transfer of authority, they get intelligence from the Afghan NDS, Afghan National Security Directorate in Lashkar that there is an impending attack by the Taliban, and it's quite large scale. They task a whole bunch of reconnaissance assets to go into the sky. This is Lashkar. There we go. Lots of stuff flying around trying to look for Taliban. And they discover 3 lines of Taliban attack and 300 Taliban massing for attack. That's absolutely huge attack. Bear in mind, there were no maneuver companies in or near Lashkar. You had a handful of troops guarding the main British base. That was it. Most British troops were in the north or the south of Helmand. They had to rely on Afghan security forces to protect Lashkar. Fortunately, also a lot of ISAF firepower. That was all tasked, and it obliterated most of the Taliban attackers, so they didn't. But the Taliban attack was designed to kill Mangal, discredit the British. It was supposed to be a real knockout blow. and was a main attack that came across the Bolan Bridge. Now, a 3 Commander Brigade let a whole bunch of Taliban escape. And they let them escape across the bridge, and then they followed them. And they simply watched where they went. Babaji, Nadali, Marja. That's where the attack came from. Right next door. Right under the noses of the British, the Taliban had re-established a major foothold in this area. That then became the object for the next 18 months. And the next 3 tours were focused on this. You had Sanshara, which was a campaign by 3 Commander Brigade to get a foothold in Nadali here, followed by Pangshai Palan, which was a major offensive by 19 Brigade to clear the Babaji Payor up here, followed finally under 11 Brigade by Operation Moshtarak, which was to clear the Shanajir Triangle up here, and that coincided with the US Marine Corps clear of Marja. Over 18 months, this whole area was cleared of Taliban, and quite successfully so, actually. So, we get to the end of the story. What can we say about the characteristics of the British approach? The first is ever closer civil-military integration. I'll give you one little illustration. Basically, those of you, and my wife, Ellen Lambert, has reminded me that I have to be careful about acronyms and military. You spend a lot of time around the military, and before you know it, their way of speaking, the kind of the acronyms that they use, kind of rub off on you. But in a military shop, you have different staff branches. J5 are plans, J3 operations, what's happening now, and in between J3, 5, they do planning out to 3 days. Okay. Under 16 Brigade, you had the J5, the plan section, was taken out of the brigade headquarters and put slap bang in the middle of the provincial reconstruction team. And this was part of a close partnership between Brigadier Mark Hartland-Smith and the new 2-star head of the PRT, Hugh Powell. And they created between them the civil-military mission at Helmand. Now, you have to visit Lashkar to appreciate that simple move, how important it was. Previously, you had to walk out of the task force headquarters, you walk for 3 or 4 minutes into the PRT, you walk up to the confidential room of the PRT, and you're faced with the door. The door has a key code. British soldiers did not have the key code to get in the door. How good was civil-military integration? Not great. Mark Hartland-Smith picks up his planners and he goes, right, you go across the road and you're going to sit now in the PRT. That was a very important small move. 3 Brigade follow on and they go, okay, we're going to put a civilian in the 3-5 shop. So the guys doing the planning after 3 days will have a civilian. And T Brigade come along and they put a civilian in the 3 shop. So they have the people doing the operations, day-to-day operations, a civilian. So you're getting in that little illustration of ever closer integration. And then 11 Brigade doing Operation Moshtarak. Well, planning becomes incredibly important for that. The civilians don't have enough planners, so they bring over a whole bunch of military planners and give them to the civilians. The second characteristic is use of messaging to shape operations. That's basically saying in advance, this is what we're going to do. You tell the civilians, we're going to come and clear your area of insurgents, and then we're going to stay. That's very important. So we're going to stay, we're going to reconstruct, we're here for the long term. And you say to the enemy, we're going to come and clear this area in massive force. And what you want is for the enemy to clear off and for the civilians to stick around and or at least come back so that you can stabilize the area. And you see that in how 52 Brigade cleared Musakala. 52 Brigade inherit a mission which is really out of nowhere. Musakala, which had been captured by the British and given back to the Taliban, given back to locals, Taliban took control. And then 52 Brigade have an opportunity to retake it. And Mackay's approach is to signal heavily in advance, slowly approach Musakala, spend a number of weeks approaching it slowly so the Taliban have plenty of time to clear out because he doesn't want a big battle. And he heavily messages. Clearly, 19 Brigade, when they do their big clear of the Babaji Pair, do heavy messaging in advance to create a golden bridge so that civilians can escape. They're warning the civilians what's happening. And the point is, ordinarily military operations, you don't announce what you're going to do. It's called the element of surprise. You're not supposed to announce it. So this is quite revolutionary stuff, saying, we're going to come, we're going to, a big operation, you know that. But it enables civilians to escape. So there were only 3 civilian casualties. That was the summer of fighting. Very heavy fighting here. Only 3 civilian casualties. And likewise, with 11th Brigade that follows, in the clear of Shanajir Triangle in northern Nadali, heavy messaging to try and clear out the Taliban and warn the civilians. 0 casualties. And the third and final characteristic is closer partnership over a period of time with the Afghans. In 52 Brigade, it's interesting, they take a lot of risk in this. Mackay says, Afghan ownership of the security architecture is absolutely critical to the transition peace. And he says we have to show immense patience and steady nerves, because the fact is the Afghans weren't really up to much at that time. But you see as time goes on, better opportunities for integrated planning. 19th Brigade has integrated planning at brigade and battle group level with the Afghan partners. And still, that's a lot better, but as the units come together for combined forces, there's not as much integration as you would hope, perhaps. So Afghan companies and British companies who are going into combat together, they meet for the first time in the helicopter landing zone, get on the helicopters, fly off to combat. So 11th Brigade that follows on from that, they assemble the combined force in Bastion weeks in advance of the operation. They do combined training with Afghans and British forces. So the combined force, when it gets off the helicopter, they've trained together beforehand, they can operate. The last 20 minutes, let me just give you 5 top takeaways I had 2 cuts. And these are, I'll have more cuts to the story. But basically, I'm moving now to a more conventional campaign history, trying to dig down into the primary source material and interview participants to get a more nuanced picture of what is, over time, British brigades adapting, learning, and over time, with more resources, getting better and more capable. Anyone who studies COIN will not be surprised by this first takeaway. But the point is the campaign in Helmand shows it. There's a lot of talk now about platforms, the regional platform, which is basically the development activity. This is, to my mind, the main counterinsurgency platform. And in fact, it was David McCullen in his 28 articles, his famous 28 articles, Guidance for Company Battalion Commanders, reflecting on Iraq. He said, you have to get out of your armoured vehicles and get out in the ground and have presence. Because otherwise you're looking like day trippers from hell that just sort of descend from your armoured boxes like aliens to talk to the locals. That won't work. You have to get out and about. That involves taking a lot more risk, of course. But it also means that small wars need big armies. Now, this is a problem for European militaries. It's less of a problem for the Americans, obviously. But for European militaries, they have, either because they're small militaries like the British or large militaries like the Europeans who just can't generate a lot of deployable force. And this shortage of troops was a real issue time and again for British commanders. Even with Mackay and 52 Brigade having to retake Musakala, his whole approach was, I'm not going to move anyone from the bases. You're there for 6 months to build local relationships. He had to strip troops from all his bases in order to feed that one big offensive. So he went against his major approach. Likewise, with 16 Brigade and moving the turbines up to Gajaki Dam, their major operation, meant they had to strip troops out of central Helmand in order to do that big operation. That was necessary. But of course, you are loosening your control over key ground that the insurgents can re-infiltrate. And likewise, 19th Brigade, for their big offensive to clear the Babaji Pair, required them to take some troops away from central Nadali, and again, gave the insurgents some opportunities to return. The point is, the commanders had no choice. They simply didn't have enough troops. They had to make some really tough decisions. Fortunately, this is where the Americans come in. It's really helped, actually. We've obviously seen a huge upswing since 2009, in particular, American presence. What we see in 2009, 2010 is the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Brigade arrives in Helmand. And over a period of time, 10,000 American Marines sweep into Helmand. Makes a hell of a difference. So, for instance, the 19th Brigade's offensive in Babaji was coordinated with a major US Marine Corps offensive in the south, in Garmsia, Narwa, and Keniston. And likewise, 11th Brigade's offensive that followed to clear northern Nadali was coordinated with an offensive in Marja. That's really helped, actually. And of course, this is what you see, which is the main effort has been the south. Look how many troops it's taken. Half of all the ISAF troops that were available in 2010 were committed to the campaign in Helmand and Kandahar. most of those in Helmand. The fact is, COIN takes a lot of troops. David Petraeus suggested that you have to have a ratio of 25 counterinsurgents per 1,000 population. If that's true, Helmand has a population of 1,450,000. You need over 37,000 troops. Fortunately, actually, for all their flaws, largely illiterate, a little bit corrupt, not very well trained, some of them are on drugs, Afghans still want them. In a survey of the public opinion in Nadali, locals wanted Afghan army first, ISAF second, police third, and very poor third. They'd rather not have the police at all. And equally, a national survey in 2010, the Asia Foundation, the largest, most reliable survey of 6,500 people across the entire Afghanistan, 89% recognized that the Afghan National Army helps improve security. And hence this has been a major priority. Of course, we need it for transition as well, to grow Afghan numbers. And very impressive. I mean, in this sense, ISAF has far exceeded its targets. I think it's really necessary at this point to talk about Ireland. That's where Britain has also had some experience of counterinsurgency. And there was a little matter of a little rebellion between 1990 and 1921. The British didn't have terrific success in suppressing, and it came to a negotiated settlement. And that then followed with a civil war between 1922 and 1923. Now, a far less well-equipped, far less well-trained Irish force defeated the rebels in 1 year flat. With some support from the British, this is the bombing, the shelling of the forecourts in the summer of 1922. That there is British artillery, kindly provided by the British to help shell the rebels. But the point is, co-ethnics, in this case, Irish and Irish, make much better counterinsurgents. They have better intelligence, they have better local contacts, they know where these guys are. And also they can be more vicious. Bottom line is they can be more brutal and not trigger a national backlash. These guys were brutal. By the end, they were executing. They'd take out 6 IRA guys and just execute them all in retaliation whenever the IRA did an atrocity. They were doing that by 1923. They just took the wind out of the sails of the rebellion. Second point, unity of command and therefore unity of approach. For much of the campaign, ISAF has not been fighting one war. It's broadly speaking been fighting two campaigns, one in the west and the north, which is largely a sort of peace operation, stability operation, and then in the south and the east it's been more like a war. But actually, arguably, there's been even more. Look at all these little flags. Dutch, Canadians, British, all individual campaigns with very loose support, a very loose direction from ISAF. Robert Thompson, the British counterinsurgency theorist with experience in Malaya and reflecting on the experience of Vietnam, said what you need in counterinsurgency is a man and a plan. You need unity of command and a clear plan. In the summer of 2009, this was the man, and he had a plan, General McChrystal, Stanley McChrystal. And his plan basically was, we're going to secure the population, protect the population. Number 1 priority. Number 2 priority, closer partnership with the Afghan security forces. And he also said, look, this is a dog's breakfast. You have tons of different wars going on in Afghanistan. Therefore, I'm going to have a centralized direction. He created a thing called the ISAF Joint Command, a 3-star headquarters, to drive command down through the whole campaign. And he said we're going to have some main efforts, and the main effort was in the south. Hence, we see all the concentration of ISAF resources in the south. And actually, I did a survey of IJC after 12 months in October for the commander, General David Rodriguez. And sure enough, as much as, I went all around Afghanistan, interviewed all these senior commanders, they all bitched like mad about resources. They all said we don't have enough resources. Everyone complained. In fact, it was a bit of a therapy session. The first 10 minutes of every interview was them just unloading. But without exception, they all said, and many of them have experience, having been in Afghanistan before, it was much better with the centralized command under ISAF Joint Command, because you had central direction. You knew where the campaign was going. Point, though, is, what was the effort in his plan again? Secure the population, closer partnership with the Afghan security forces. This was stuff the British had been doing at that stage for quite some time, well over a year, and in fact had been in the intent of British commanders almost from the beginning. Third point. These days we talk about COIN, there's big interest in influence operations, non-kinetic activities. getting the military to do kind of very unmilitary stuff. Can't lose sight of the fact that COIN involves a lot of bloody fighting. It involves major combat operations. I need to do more research on this, but my strong intuition is that opening phase of 18 months of hard fighting in Helmand was simply unavoidable. It was necessary to cause quite considerable attrition to the Taliban, to force them to change their tactics into a different way, to push them onto the back foot. We now talk about the Taliban being pushed on their back foot, but I think in that early phase, they were very much pushed into the back foot. Then they recalibrated and took a different approach, but that was an approach we could work with, the asymmetric approach. This, by the way, in case you're wondering, actually I pulled this off the web, and the tagline was, this is a Taliban killed in action. It's not. This is Taliban casualty evacuation. Very basic stuff. You drag the guy away. This guy's injured. He'll be fine. But the point is, they really care about this stuff. There's no doubt, the intelligence shows they really care about casualty evacuation. They care about those evacuation routes. So, you know, they're not these... some of them are fanatics, of course, but not all of them. So if you can exploit that, you can really, for instance, in the clear of northern Nadali, the British exploited that. They threatened the casualty evacuation routes to put pressure on the Taliban, and it largely worked. That said, COIN requires big battles, if possible. Best to avoid them in district centres. And here's where the British emphasis on messaging is so important, because that's where Mackay doing it in Muscala, but likewise it was very evident in Moshtarak in the clearing of the Shanajir Triangle, persuading the Taliban to cede ground in the face of overwhelming force. Because what you want to do is secure the population centres, not scare the population off and have them return to a bombed out town. But also what's very important in this whole effort of trying to reduce the risk of major fights in population centres is special forces. If you actually look at Operation Moshtarak, the clear of northern Nadali, it involved two things. One was messaging, telling the population, we're coming, we're staying. Telling the Taliban, we're coming, and we're going to kick the hell out of you. At the same time, special forces guys going in and taking out, I believe the expression is remove from the battlefield, which is kill or capture, 29 Taliban leaders. So in advance of the mission, ISAF eviscerated the Taliban operational command in Nadali. So when the British pushed in, the Taliban defense literally collapsed. Taliban commanders were remotely trying to command the Taliban units in the field from a very great distance, and they were very quickly lost situational awareness and were overwhelmed. And this reflects now a new emphasis under ISAF. General Petraeus, as you probably know, took over from General McChrystal in July of 2010 because of this unfortunate business with Rolling Stone. And General Petraeus, interesting enough, although he was the guy that was focusing on the soft aspect of COIN in Iraq and trying to encourage guys to the units in Iraq to build closer ties with the local community. In ISAF, he's now focusing very heavily on the combat piece, and particularly the kill, capture, special operations piece. His people have said the gloves have come off. And his new approach is relentless pursuit of the Taliban. And hence, Sir David Richards, the Chief of the General Staff, told the House of Commons Defence Committee in November of just past November, we're hammering the Taliban at the moment. That was both due to the major conventional operations in Helmand, which cleared the Taliban out of central Helmand, in and around Kandahar, but also this. This is the 90-day accumulator over a 3-month period up to the end of September. Almost 300 insurgent leaders have been killed or captured. 2,000 insurgents have been removed from the battlefield, captured. Another 900 have been removed by being killed. We're talking about industrial-scale special forces operations. This is the hidden part of the campaign that doesn't get discussed so much because, of course, it's so highly classified. But there's very considerable evidence now that this is having an effect. It's wearing down the insurgency to a considerable degree. But that moves us on to these guys. We tend to think of the insurgents as super agile. They're all like little supermen. Super agile, we're cumbersome, we're big Western armies clunk around. They're super agile. Well, actually, if you look closely at, if you look at the campaign, what you find is they're not that agile. Yeah, they can adapt their tactics just as the British can adapt their tactics. But interestingly enough, what you find in the, and again, it's a case study I've looked at in detail, the insurgent defense of Nadali for Operation Moshkrak in February of 2010, is a few months beforehand, the British cleared them out of northern Nadali just before they were going to push into the Cat Triangle. And how did the British do it? Well, they did helicopter assaults direct. They flew over the Taliban front lines, and they did helicopter assaults directly on top of the Taliban, directly on top of their strongholds. Taliban defense collapses. If they were super agile, they'd go, okay, that's how they're going to come. We better come up with some kind of defense. The British assaulted the Taliban stronghold a few months later in the exact same way. And guess what? The Taliban defense collapsed. They ain't taken at all, but the point is they don't have to be. Because on the other hand, they just have to be able to intimidate locals and take pot shots at ISAF forces. That's enough to destabilize an area. And that's our problem. And that's why it becomes so essential to study the other side of the hill. It's quite clear now that what we have in Helmand is an insurgency that combines central direction coming across from Baluchistan from the Quetta-Shura Taliban, combined with drug interests, combined with tribal rivalries. And tribal dynamics are key here. You have in northern Helmand, you've got what is basically a three-way tribal split between the Alakazai, the Alizai, and the Ishkazai. Whereas in the north, it's much more complex. But it's critical to understand, in the south, it's much more mixed. It's critical to understand this mixture. So, for instance, when the British arrive into central Helmand and they're pushing in, one of the critical things they have to understand is some of the insurgency has been generated because the Nadali police are primarily controlled by one tribe, the Norzai, which understandably creates problems for other tribes. And so there's a tribal tension here. There's some evidence to suggest that over time, the amount of resources that have been coming from the Quetta-Shura Taliban have reduced. And the amount of resources that the Taliban have generated locally through drug interests and so forth have increased. And this also would be quite important, because with resources come influence. It would suggest that local dynamics are becoming increasingly important to the character of the insurgency in Helmand. And here, in terms of the British approach, the British have been slow to develop this capability, but they are developing the capability now to get better situational awareness of this, better cultural understanding of the human terrain. Last point is the 80%. And we're back to that French guy, David Gallois. David Gallois said that in these new counter-revolutionary wars, they are 20% military action, 80% political action. This is a photograph I have actually taken, not from the web. This is the governor's compound, Habibullah's compound in Nadali. It's his main corridor. His office is here. Two things that are really important about this picture. One is when I visited here in October of 2009, there were lots of people milling around. People sitting in the corridor, just hanging around. Basically, there was no work getting done. There are people in all of these offices. And you know what? They're actually doing work. And the other thing is, you can find out who's doing what. Here's the judiciary office. Here's the administration office. There were no signs going down the corridor. It was just a bunch of people hanging out. In other words, this was when I visited in May of 2010. So what I took away from this was governance in Nadali had improved. It was actually beginning to function. Not perfectly. This guy who was the prosecutor, he had actually been, he was a young guy. He was looking a bit lost, actually. They had just nabbed him from Kabul a few months beforehand. The trick to get a prosecutor down into Helmand is you go up to Kabul, and when they graduate, you simply grab them and say, hey, come on down to Helmand. Before they know it, they're down there. So he looked a bit lost. But also, what was really interesting when I witnessed the security shura was you could see the beginnings of proper teamwork between the district chief of police, between the Kandak commander, the Afghan army commander. Whereas previously there had been fisticuff fights between the police and the army. Now they were finally beginning to cooperate a bit. So if we're focusing on the 80%, that's a key COIN capability right there. This is the Civil Service Training Centre in Helmand. That's where the effort has to be. Unfortunately, that's where an effort is now being put. British PRT in Helmand has grown very considerably over the period. And that has been a key thing that has enabled the British military campaign in Helmand. But also, centrally directed programs, such as the District Delivery Program. It's a program to rapidly build. It was a program that was by the Afghan government, started in January of 2010. Over a 2-year period, they were going to rapidly accelerate district governance in 80 key districts over 2 years. And 6 were trialled in 2010, and of these 4 were in Helmand. This is my concluding thought. And the point is, actually, if you read the first plans of the first brigadiers going in, people like Jerry Thomas and John Lorimer, they totally got this. It was governance. This piece was about governance and development, but you had to do security first. But the thing I want to emphasize is, and it was certainly true back in 2006 and 2007, there was no way you had to do the security piece. And as I said, I think the whole attrition, the war against the Taliban was necessary. Now the emphasis must be on this. It is governance foremost. And clearly you see it in Moshtarak, which is the latest big offensive in February of 2010. The commander of that, British General Nick Carter, said in his guidance to the task force commanders in Helmand, Commander R.C. South said that governance was going to be at the tip of the spear. This is what this big operation is all about. And interesting enough, what were the key metrics he was tracking? He would track, each district has metrics that track in progress, 16 or so metrics. The top 6 metrics were all about governance, and they were the ones that Major General Carter cared about most. Now, of course, the problem is you can make mistakes here. Famously, of course, General McChrystal said that with Marja, we would have governance in a box. We'd clear Marja, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, governance would spring out of a box. And as it turned out, it did not happen that way. And therefore, there are 2, and these are my closing thoughts, key lessons. The one is, creating governance takes time. If you look at the campaign by 3, 19, and 11 Brigade, it took them 18 months to clear central Helmand and build governance in Nadali. It takes time. And this, of course, has been a problem for General McChrystal and for ISAF headquarters, is they haven't got much time because they're under immense pressure from Washington to show progress. So in January of 2010, when I was out there, it was quite clear they were struggling with this issue. They wanted to accelerate the campaign because they simply didn't have time. And they knew, for instance, that building district governance was going to take time. They just didn't have it. The second and final thought is this, that I come back to this what I said previously. You're only as good as the government you support in counterinsurgency. In Helmand, we've been very fortunate to have a very good provincial governor in Governor Mangal. In Nadali, there's been a good governor in Habibullah. Now we have a better governor in Sangin. That's really important. And Faisal Haq. Unfortunately, in Marja, it didn't work so well. And this guy, Haji Zaire, who was the governor who was put into the new district of Marja, it transpired he'd served 4 years in a prison in Germany for attempting to murder his stepson. He'd stabbed him because the stepson objected to him to Haji Zaire beating his wife. Not perhaps a role model for the kind of governance we want to build in Afghanistan. Don't want to end on a negative thought, but that really is the kind of challenge we're facing. But if the problem is getting the right governor in place, I think we've come an awful long way from the problem being the Taliban are at the gates. We're having to fire off heavy ammo just to keep them at bay. Thank you very much.
I'm not really bothered, so I'm happy to go to reception. I can take questions. I don't care.
It's part of the tradition, which I'm not quite sure why, but it is part of the tradition of inaugurals, is that we don't do questions, but we go and have a reception instead where questions can be put directly to our speaker. So please come up, and I think it's in the just outside to enjoy that. But I want to first, before we go out for a reception, to thank Theo enormously for a very thought-provoking and full and in some ways encouraging lecture about developments in Helmand and the advantage of just getting to know what it's like on the ground, getting to know the people on the ground, seeing how they operate and the challenges that they face. It's a story that's not over yet, and no doubt a second version of this lecture in some years' time may look different. But the sense of development, the importance of the consequences of changing brigades, the role of the Americans, and in particular the emphasis on governance right at the end, does bring home the fact that one of the things about these campaigns, and one can think of others as well, is an awful lot of time is spent relearning lessons that might have been got from previous campaigns. But with that, on your behalf, I want to thank Theo very much indeed for an excellent lecture, and we can now go and celebrate, talk about it. Thanks very much. If you look on here, behind there.
Sorry, I can turn the lights down.
Yeah, we had no idea.
So,
It's on there, is it?
somewhere.
I don't know whether we couldn't do it.